Most everyone can tell you why Georgia Tech isn't in the SEC, but we're going to tell you why Georgia Tech isn't in the SEC right now.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. I've been looking forward to this podcast for a long time. We are going to explain to you what happened after Georgia Tech left the SEC and why they weren't able to get back in. We're going to give you a little bit of backstory, going to tell you the original story, and we're going to tell you about that 10-year period that went into the 70s when people were trying to get the Yellow Jackets back in the SEC and what stopped that from happening. Anyway, thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Do us a favor, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the bell for notifications and new videos whenever we put them up, and of course, upvote the video itself. We would appreciate it. Once we hit 1,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel, we will be doing Postgame Live, a live post-game show during football season this fall. Looks like we're going to make it. We're about 93% of the way there now. So thank you for all of that. Anyway, today's show is going to be about Georgia Tech. Now, we have Bryce Coon coming on in the second half, but the first half is going to be me telling the story of why Georgia Tech isn't in the league right now. Now, in the early 40s, Ole Miss played a game at Atlanta. It was the first regular season game where Ole Miss played Georgia Tech in the SEC. It was in like 1946. It was the year before Johnny Vaught. And Bobby Dodd was the coach of Georgia Tech. And he had an issue for whatever it was against the smaller, more rural areas of Mississippi. He wanted to go to Dallas. He wanted to go to New Orleans. He wanted to go to, I guess, I would say Nashville, but I'm not sure what it was at that time. He wanted to go to Jacksonville, wanted to go, all of that stuff. He wanted good places for his fans to go to. You hear that all the time. Fan bases talking about traveling to real places and good places and things like that. And there's supposed to be rewards for that. You hear Ole Miss fans talk about how they want to go play road games at Tulane because their fans want to go to New Orleans. Well, Bobby Dodd did that. And it ruffled some feathers because once Johnny Vaught got to Ole Miss, Georgia Tech was one of the powerful teams in the league at that time. They were the team in Georgia. In the 10 years before Georgia Tech left the SEC, Ole Miss and Georgia Tech combined for like 6 or 7 SEC championships. This was a legit potential rivalry there, and Johnny Vaught wanted that to happen. And Bobby Dodd, like I said, had an aversion to going anywhere that might be viewed as someplace they didn't want to travel. So Bobby Dodd offered up a 2-for-1 to go to Oxford, and Johnny Vaught wouldn't do it. It was home and home or nothing. It was a very stubborn thing. And Bobby Dodd said no and just went on. So just to let you know, in our history, in Ole Miss's history, when 50 years happened of the Southern Conference and the SEC, when they were in it together, they played one conference game in Atlanta. Georgia Tech has never gone to Ole Miss. They've never been to Oxford. They've never been to Jackson. They played a non-conference game recently at Mississippi State, but they had never gone to Oxford. And that became a fun little needling thing in a similar way that Steve Spurrier did with Tennessee. And the fact that he bragged about not playing Ole Miss and Mississippi State. He bragged about that over and over and over again, and it became a ego trip for him. We're too good to go to there. We don't have to do that. We don't want to do that. And then all through the 40s and 50s, they did that. And even when Ole Miss was becoming the dominant brand in SEC football, Ole Miss won like 4 of 6 SEC titles from like 58 to 63. So when that happened, that was the relationship. It was highly strained. Bobby Dodd spoke about in his memoirs about the Sugar Bowl game that they played against Ole Miss in like 1952 or 1953. He bragged about Ole Miss and Mississippi State people wanting to hurt him because he won't play them. It became a character. It became something that he was known about. And I just give you that backstory right there because it's going to come into play a little bit later. Now, in the mid-'60s, the SEC was getting ready to pass the 140 rule. And that simply stated that football and basketball could only account for a total of 140 scholarships. That's all the rule said. Now, I've heard this part of the story both ways. I heard that Bobby Dodd thought that there was too many scholarships in the SEC. I've heard that. But I've also read that he didn't want to take the scholarships away from people that earned it. So I don't know which side he opposed it, but he opposed the 140 rule. That's the important part. He opposed the 140 rule. And they had it set up to where him and Bear Bryant had a secret alliance. Real tough that Bear Bryant was going to vote against it as well. So sure, lo and behold, it was 6-6 with one vote left to go. Alabama voted for it. The president voted for it, which kind of fractured the relationship between Bear Bryant and Bobby Dodd. Remember, Alabama and Georgia Tech is a big deal. Georgia Tech is in Alabama's fight song. Georgia Tech is a big deal to Alabama. Or it was. But this fractured that relationship. Georgia Tech ended up giving up like the previous 10 years or something. Their record in the SEC was like 200 and 100. It was actually really good for that period. But they left and they got delusions of grandeur just like Tulane, that they were going to become Notre Dame and become the great independent force in Southern college football, which obviously did not work at all. So they go independent. They struggle over the next little bit. They're as an independent, I think they're 100 and 100. It's not very good. So when we come back after this break from Rock Auto, I'm going to tell you exactly how Ole Miss plays into this. I've given you backstory all the way through to the point where Georgia Tech left. Now, I will tell you exactly how this pertains. The 70s. Nobody talks about the SEC and Georgia Tech in the 70s. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Wind near the often pointless and seemingly intimidating questioning, is your Odyssey an LX or an EX, and wait for the person behind the counter to order the parts on your computer. You have computers. You have access to rockauto.com. There's no need to go through just their brand. You can do all of that. Remember, this is a company that's family owned. They save you time and money. And the prices are reliably low for all customers. In this age of hyperinflation, that would absolutely count to what's going on. So go explore their easy-to-use website today and find the solution to your auto parts need. So go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car and truck. Write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices. rockauto.com. We have an important favor to ask of you. We've put together a survey so we can learn more about the listeners like you and make your favorite Locked On podcast even better. This is your opportunity to tell us what you like and what you don't like about the Locked On podcast. So go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey right now to get started. It won't take you very long, and everyone that completes a survey can qualify for a chance to win one of 10 Ticketmaster gift cards. To take our audience survey, go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey. Thank you for your help. All right. In the first segment, we talked about the history of Georgia Tech. We gave you the background of the Ole Miss and Georgia Tech series and why that is relevant. And Georgia Tech has left the SEC, and this is where the story ends to most people. But the fact of the matter is, it was kind of a half-cocked decision to go independent. It was that ego that I told you about earlier. that Bobby Dodd not being willing to play Ole Miss, it kind of got the better of him. And they left the SEC and essentially the comfort of all these teams. Now, nobody could have known the amount of money that was going to be on the table in the future. But this decision to leave absolutely ruined that. It's a decision that could end up costing Georgia Tech $50 million a year. I'll say that again. It's a decision that may end up costing Georgia Tech $50 million a year. Now, after Georgia Tech went independent, there were efforts to bring them back in. Famously, Bobby Dodd and Bear Bryant fixed their fractured relationship to the point where Bear Bryant was willing to sponsor Georgia Tech back into the conference with the Alabama. Because like I told you before, the Alabama-Georgia Tech game was a big deal. But once they started informally polling around, they had some votes, but it needed to be unanimous. And Ole Miss and Mississippi State would not agree to it under any circumstances, and it eventually died. Again, they had the votes from everybody else, but Ole Miss and Mississippi State would not agree to it, partly because of their attitude towards the state of Mississippi previously under Bobby Dodd. See, this is a situation when you start talking, you never know when you're going to need somebody. You never know when you're going to need something. You know, Bobby Dodd stomping his feet over the 140 rule and everything and making a rash decision to leave the conference because, okay, let's just do this then. This will be fine. And them trying to get back in and realizing that you absolutely alienated two people that you desperately needed their vote. So it died. Then a couple years later, it all started back up again with Georgia Tech back into the SEC. Vince Dooley this time sponsoring the Yellow Jackets, a Georgia coach sponsoring their rival to come back into the league. And once again, Vince Dooley he was asked about it in an interview and said, no, there's a couple of teams out west that are dead set against him. So, what do we learn from this? A, don't do anything rash by leaving a conference. Because if you need somebody, then, if you're in there, they can't really do anything about it. But if you leave and you need them back, they're going to come back and get you. B, do not act like you're better than going anywhere. A, the scheduling needs to be in the conference's hand instead of the coaches. It was very cliquish back in the day. If you look at Ole Miss's all-time records, they've only played like Florida 26 times. They've only played Kentucky a few times. It's very regional. It was very cliquish. Back in the day, Ole Miss played Georgia every year. They played Tennessee every year. They played LSU every year. They did not play Alabama very much. They did not play Auburn very much. But they played Mississippi State. And it was very cliquish. It was like a high school lunchroom back in the SEC back in the day. But because of that, and the fact that everybody wasn't in it together, it led to fissures. And people were able to exploit that. And once Ole Miss and State knew that they had gotten the better of Georgia Tech whenever they decided on that ego trip to go independent, they just held the grudge. Johnny Vaught never forgot that he absolutely refused to come to Mississippi and play football. Never forgot. Mississippi State, Ole Miss and Mississippi State take a lot of heat. But whenever it comes to stuff about Mississippi, they will unify in a hurry. If they think somebody is out to get Mississippi, they will unify against that person. And that is the situation that happened here. But this is all an ego thing. Bobby Dodd doing his Steve Spurrier rubber chicken circuit talking about Ole Miss and State really just jumped back to bit them in the butt. And it's all because, if they wouldn't have left in the first place, there wouldn't have been this mad dash to try and get them back in that was unsuccessful. But it was unsuccessful because of Ole Miss and State. Because of what he did. Because of scheduling. The fact that Georgia Tech thought they were too good to come to the state of Mississippi when they were in the same conference with them. And the grudges that are being held against that made sure that Ole Miss and State would stonewall them. Now, my question is, we have a situation to where if Ole Miss and State, I don't know if we're past that. I know we have a home and home this year and next year against Georgia Tech at Ole Miss. In 2023 will be the end of that long argument. Johnny Vaught trying to get Georgia Tech on campus or in Jackson. That'll finally end next year. Mississippi State has already played home and home with them. So with the SEC looking at its own playoff, and make no mistake, whenever they say a SEC only playoff, it's not going to be the 16 teams. It's going to be 24 teams, 26 teams, 28 teams. And it's going to look more like the NFL. With North Carolina, Clemson, Florida State, and Miami probably coming over as well. Now, we have probably 10 years until that happens, but it's on the table. But the question is, would Georgia Tech be able to, would the door be open for them to come back? They offer Atlanta. That's where SEC Media Days is this year. The SEC wants Atlanta. They need Atlanta. That's where the SEC championship game is. Atlanta is an important part of this league. And I don't think people can understand what it means. What that decision meant in 1964 when they decided to go independent over something's just silly. They threw it all away over a, forced part of pride. I don't know. I don't know what happened, but they did that. But would they be open? We talked to Bryce Coon just a second about would the SEC be open to bring them back in? Would Georgia Tech be open to coming back in? Because what's going to happen is the Southern Conference from way back in the 20s, before the SEC was formed, when it was 22, 24 teams, they're reforming that. In a way. They're not going to ask Sewanee, obviously. Probably not going to ask Tulane. But they might ask Georgia Tech. Grudges are gone. People are dead and gone. All of this happened. Ole Miss and State are playing Georgia Tech. Like I said, the game will happen next year where Georgia Tech comes to Mississippi, comes to Oxford. That's a big deal. People don't realize this is a big deal, but it is an 80-year-old argument at this point. The first regular season game scheduled between Ole Miss and Georgia Tech was in Atlanta in 1946. Bobby Dodd only played that game because the previous coach scheduled it. He did not schedule that game. Johnny Vaught came in and tried to get games scheduled because the year before Ole Miss played Georgia Tech. And whenever you go there and get into a new thing, the first thing you try to do, you see what it had before. Georgia Tech was on the schedule. You probably call them. It was probably a contentious phone call. It just is what it is. But it led to Johnny Vaught having a lifelong grudge against Bobby Dodd and Georgia Tech. And here's the thing. As much as they did this to Ole Miss and Ole Miss got its just desserts and all of this happened, Ole Miss went and 10 years later did the same thing to Southern Miss. Too good to play you. Too good to understand anything. Too good to do anything. We just don't want any more anymore. So the last time Ole Miss played Southern Mississippi was 1984. I can't stand this attitude. If you lose a game, you lose a game. If you win a game, you win a game. There's no big picture stuff that happens in these games. The ridiculousness that Bobby Dodd had with his scheduling philosophy towards Ole Miss and State is the same thing that Ole Miss and State have with Southern. It's not different at all. So keep that in mind. But I thought it was very interesting that Ole Miss and State were keenly responsible, absolutely there, for Georgia Tech not being in the SEC. We got Bryce Coon coming up to preview the Yellow Jackets and say what's going on. But right now, I need to tell you about our partners at BetOnline. They continue to be the number one source for all your betting needs and sports information. Find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, minor league baseball scores, fights, and even next season's NFL futures. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Now, if you look at it, Ole Miss is a 21.5 point favorite over Troy for the season opener, and there are 7.5 games is set as their over-under on wins. If you want to see others that might fill that role, you can check them out at betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. Now, for your next listen, check out Locked On, or just check us out at iTunes. We're on there as well. You can give us a 5-star review. You can say whatever you want to say. You can say Steve doesn't know what he's talking about. His guests so outnumber him, and they're so much better. Just leave a 5-star review. Anyway, on that note, I'm here with Bryce Coon from Georgia Tech. We're here to talk about a little bit of Yellow Jacket and Rebel football. Because back in the day, believe it or not, Ole Miss and Georgia Tech didn't play much, even though they were in the same conference for years and years. And I think there was I don't know, maybe John Heisman had a problem with Ole Miss. I'm not sure if there's a background there, but they hardly ever played. Before we get started, tell people the name of the 24/7 site that you work for and any advertisements you want to give there.
Yeah, we're with GoJackets.com, the 24/7 sports affiliate for Georgia Tech, and so it's continued to grow. And you and I were talking right before the show started. There's really no off season, so spring football kind of concluded. We're in this transfer portal flurry still, so it's really exciting to kind of see this new age college football. For guys like us, content really never stops. I mean, it's just constantly there.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And Ole Miss and Georgia Tech, they're playing this year. It's a game that, like I said before, for some reason they just didn't play very often. But Georgia Tech is such an integral part of SEC history. It's like it's in Alabama's fight song. You know, the rivalry with Georgia is legit. Georgia Tech was legit back in the day. And it's kind of nice to see this former rivalry, I don't know what you want to call it, the game actually being played.
Yeah, it really is. I've got some stuff here, and, they've played, last time they played was 2013 in the Music City Bowl. So for a lot of us, 2013 seems like it was like last year. That's almost 10 years. Like, that's crazy to think about the last time these two teams played. But, I think it's good. Well, first off, from the Georgia Tech side of things, fans may not feel that, because the out-of-conference schedule, even without Ole Miss, is still very, very difficult. They got to go down to UCF. Obviously, they're playing Georgia every single year. But it's one of those things, if you want to be able to be recognized nationally, you're going to have to schedule some big-time games. And really, if you're outside of the SEC, maybe the Big Ten, maybe you, as an ACC member, when the conference has really not been, it's been very top-heavy, you've got to have marquee wins elsewhere. And so I think this is going to be a fun game. It's going to be a fun opportunity for, obviously, Rebel fans traveling up to Atlanta. I think it's going to be a very, very packed-out venue, a great weekend. And we were just talking about it, 3:30 kickoff, which means that you get plenty of tailgate time and then plenty of hangout time afterwards, which is going to set up for a good venue there in Atlanta.
Okay, Georgia Tech did not have the best year last year. They lost the running back to Alabama. Famously, Ole Miss got a defensive end from them. Tell me about what we can look forward to for Georgia Tech this year.
Yeah, so obviously Jahmyr Gibbs is headed to Tuscaloosa. He's there. He's already kind of wowed during national championship practice. He actually practiced against the first-team defense. And reports came out that he was just kind of there's some jaws dropping. Kid's very talented. The argument for, you wish a kid like that the best, but the argument in Georgia Tech's case is you weren't going to win anything really, a title, anything with him this year. He's got 1 year at most left. So you kind of had to rebuild. So I think there's some players that obviously they have a returning running back in Dante Smith. This is the team that, to me, that's done a very, very good job through the portal. For the limitations they have financially to be able to what they want to do through the NIL portion, compared to other programs, much like an Ole Miss, much like a Texas A&M, even USC, they can't be on that precedent, but what they can do is they can allocate their funds or what they want to do. They have to be smart about it. I pretty much tell people, if you've ever seen the movie Moneyball with Oakland A's, it's kind of like that approach. They've really got to be smart about it, and I think they've done that. The backfield still, to me, is going to be a strength. They've got, obviously, Dante Smith, who's an under-the-radar guy with some of the high stars they had in there. He's going to be a solid guy. They bring in Dylan McDuffie, an 1,000-yard rusher from Buffalo, who's got a good relationship with new running backs coach Mike Daniels. I don't care what level you play at. If you can rush for 1,000 yards, that's a good thing. That's never a bad thing you're bringing into the program. And then they kind of got this gadget guy, special teams, kind of a one-cut back, and Hassan Hall, transfer from Louisville. So they've got a stable that they can go to with depth and a couple of young guys as well. But the biggest thing is, I think, the calling card, and you correct me, for Ole Miss has been this past season, or this past offseason, that offense has just got a lot of key pieces in. It's going to be defense for Georgia Tech. Are they going to be able to stop opposing offenses? They didn't do that well last year. 117th overall defense. Secondary was abysmal. You talked and you mentioned Jared Ivey, the man transfer from Tech to Ole Miss. They didn't have a pass rush, and you know as well as I do when you watch football, if your secondary is not good, it's even worse to have a defensive line that can't get pressure. And they had a nightmare situation of that. So they're trying to build that with some pieces. Secondary, they added 8 guys, 2 guys from Auburn, 2 guys from Notre Dame, 1 guy from Maryland. They're trying to get talented depth to where, listen, you watch a lot of SEC football. How many times when teams play each other do you see just rotation of guys? And Tech saw that a lot last year in their opponents, especially those final 2, Notre Dame and Georgia, 2 teams that are very, very deep everywhere across the depth chart. They need that, and I think they took a step in the right direction, although it's a tough schedule to navigate still this early on in the rebuild process.
Do you think is Jeff Collins, the head coach there, right? You
Yes.
think this is his hot seat year, or does he get another year with that schedule?
Yeah, and I'll tell you this schedule's very difficult. And it's no doubt about it. It's got to be one of the more difficult ones. Obviously, Georgia, UCF, Clemson, Florida State, Pittsburgh, Wake Forest. So you're playing the 2 teams that matched up in the ACC title game, plus you're out of conference. But for me in this with Jeff Collins is, I'll just tell you straight up, unless they win like 2 games, they're not in a spot financially where they can let him go and buy him out. He just signed a 7-year contract, and partially because athletic director Todd Stansberry knew this was going to be something that took a while. Listen, Georgia Tech, and I tell fans all the time, they were operating their program in the dark ages while other teams were doing that. And it's not just because of the scheme they ran. Listen, Paul Johnson was able to do a lot with a little, and that's a calling card of what he was able to do at Georgia Tech. So Jeff Collins had to come in the first year you expected, you don't even have personnel that can run what you want to run. Year number 2 was COVID year. You're breaking in a true freshman quarterback who, Jeff Sims played well. They had the upset win against Florida State week 1, but it's still, you're teaching guys stuff through Zoom. You don't get the normal interaction. Past year was in my opinion, kind of was a year that they thought they could take a step forward, except for the defense was a nightmare. That was never supposed to be a part of the plan. So coming into this season, I think if this team can get to 5 wins, and you can say there's a realistic chance that a second year under Chip Long's offense, or a second year under Chris Weinke, the new quarterback coach, these guys can take a step forward. Not that maybe it's not in the record, but they play teams closer, and they win some of the close games they've lost in the past 3 years. I think they have to give him another year just by virtue of financially you really can't afford to buy him out. And if you do, where are you going from that? Because let's just be honest, Tech is not a hot shot destination for a head coach right now.
Yeah, but they are trying, and they're doing the branding and the cool thing, the ATL thing. Yeah. And I get all that. Now, before we move on, you care to tell Ole Miss fans what they're getting with Jared Ivey?
Yeah, to me, I'll tell you this. And Ivey, first off, is inside the locker room, he's a stand-up kid. High character, hard worker. And I'll tell you this, too. It was all potential. The numbers, I don't think, were really there for what Georgia Tech wanted to do with him, just solely for the fact they didn't have many options, and he was the go-to guy. I think he can slide into a defense like Ole Miss that has better athletes, better players than Tech's defense. And he can be a rotational rusher, but I think he can also be a guy to feature off the edge. He's got great length, a good first step, and if he's developed correctly, this is a guy that I think has NFL potential. He could be an exciting player to watch. He's lean. That was one of the biggest things we saw, that jump from year 1 to year 2, especially during the spring game for Ivey. He slimmed down but bulked up. Does that make sense? Like, it wasn't the baby fat anymore. He had been in a college weightlifting program, and that was the biggest thing for me. You could see he really took the weight room seriously, and it showed that he was a little bit quicker and a little bit stronger.
Okay, and let's talk about this real quick, even though it's a little bit of a change of subject. The ACC is famously part of the Alliance, and they are responsible for the stopping of the college football playoff from expanding and all of this in order to save football. The SEC is talking about creating its own playoff. And I don't think people realize the SEC creating their own playoff is not going to be a 16-team SEC at that point. It's going to be a 24-team or a 28-team SEC. And that's going to be to the detriment of all other conferences. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I think for over the past decade, the SEC office, when it went from Slive to Greg Sankey, has had this idea of what they want the future to look like. That to me, they've had a 5-year view instead of a 5-foot view, where I think a lot of programs and a lot of alliances per se have operated in that measure. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, think about what the SEC has done. They're adding to, and I know Texas is not what they used to, but that's a brand. That's still a very big brand. Texas and Oklahoma. I mean, let's just be real here, Stephen. I mean, you could probably count the schools that they needed to add on maybe 2 hands, maybe 1, brand-wise, to really, really cause the death of the rest of Division I Power 5 football, FBS football. I mean, you might need a USC, an Ohio State, maybe a Michigan, Clemson, Florida State, these big brands, and then you're looking, there's not really a bell cow. There's not really a this is who we follow for our conference. There's a standard for anyone else. And I think the SEC is headed that way. I mean, unless, and this is going to, translate to a lot of NIL conversation, I think that with something's going to have to happen or the SEC will break off. It'll be a 28 team mega conference that's going to essentially be above everyone else. And then you're going to have your group of 5. I always say this, your small, your lower level Power 5 teams. And then your group of 5 teams that are not in big markets, you're not your UCFs, your Houstons, stuff like your Cincinnatis. Those programs are going to suffer, and they're going to be there's going to be a fine line between them and some FCS programs that are very successful.
Yeah, and I tell people all the time on this NIL thing, the second winner besides like the Georgia Tech and Ole Miss level teams for the transfer portal and all that playing on would be the FCS schools. The FCS schools are probably going to be better than they've ever been.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. I do. I'm on the radio team for Mercer in Macon, and so that's one of the things we've seen. A lot of the guys, as we do prep work getting ready for this fall, a lot of these guys have trickled down. They've gotten a couple guys from Coastal Carolina. They've gotten a couple of, they'll poach out of the Sun Belt, out of the Conference USA. 3 guys from Western Kentucky have made their way to Mercer. So you're exactly right. The talent is going to trickle down at some point. I don't think we've seen as much trickle up as we thought, more trickle down because the portal's been so saturated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it should be interesting. But I was just curious, since you are actually covering a team that is a part of the, quote, alliance. And
yeah. Ooh, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting for sure, the alliance.
This could be the all-time backfire that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And just basically done out of jealousy of the SEC. It's ridiculous.
No, I agree completely. I mean, when that was announced, and there were rumors about it last year at ACC Media Days in Charlotte when I was there, and it was just, you heard some rumblings, and I think like a day or 2 later it started to come out. The whole thing was just kind of bizarre. And you're like, oh, it's a petty look, in my opinion. A little bit of a petty look towards the SEC.
Yeah, because Sankey is absolutely right. They have no problem with it being at 4. They could have their own playoff and championship, have one team go into the college football playoff, win it 12 times out of 16 years, and they'd be completely fine with it.
And I think, too, when you talk about, credibility amongst fans, is there's a lot of fans that would still recognize maybe the team that finishes 3rd in the SEC's version of the playoff as that team could have won the national championship. That's been an argument for so many years. And if they accumulate more big brands, that essentially what we're talking about, let's just hypothetically say that you have a playoff, that you have a 24-team SEC, and your playoff for the SEC, let's just say a Georgia, Alabama, a USC, and a Clemson, or Ohio State. You tell me.
I'd watch the hell out of that.
Yeah. we'd watch it, but you tell me outside who's going to beat those 4 teams.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about when you take everyone else away, that's potentially a Michigan State if they don't get picked up. And I mean, you tell me Oklahoma State. I mean, it's just there's a massive drop off. A Baylor, yeah, it's not going to. It just you could say, well, if Ohio State was 4th in the new SEC, they could beat any of the other 3 teams that were in the real college football playoff. I think the SEC is positioning itself for something pretty big.
Yeah, and everybody talks about it when they look at the SEC only playoff and everything. It's like, oh, college football is going to become this regional thing, and it's all going to be about that. No, because if they expand, they're going to go get USC. They're going to go get Oregon. They're going to go get Ohio State. And those people that are always in the playoffs are going to be in the SEC playoff that'll probably be rebranded.
Yeah, and too, I grew up, and I'm a little old school. I love the regionality of college football. Like, for example, I grew up in Columbus, Georgia. We're right smack dab near I-85. Here in this city, you're either an Auburn fan or a Georgia fan, and you're a diehard in the rivalries, and you would lose a little bit of that. I think you would if a lower level team gets pushed away. But I mean, look, I say all that. Money controls everything, and if I'm an Alabama fan, why wouldn't I want to see me play USC instead of I don't know, South Carolina, so stuff like that. I think money drives it. The new TV deals. I mean, there's no telling what kind of money is going to be made off of this.
Now, if this happens with Georgia Tech, basically sell their soul because they're going to go after Clemson, they're going to go after FSU, they're going to go after Miami, and they're going to go after North Carolina. Yeah, would Georgia Tech try like heck to coattail that?
I want to say that they would. And the biggest calling card they have is their market, would be in being in Atlanta. But knowing the financial parameters of what they deal with and currently some of the reluctance to put money behind football, because like I said earlier, they did a lot with a little under Paul Johnson. They didn't have to give a lot to run a triple option offense and win 7 games a year and then occasionally maybe go play in Charlotte. But I think the biggest thing is if this were to happen, a real decision would have to be made from the Tech administration, because at that point, Stephen, you're really selling to your fans, we're serious about it or we're not.
Yeah.
And if you're not, just say it. Like, if you're not serious about competing with the big boys, then let's go down and let's play at a group of 5 level, which essentially this is what it would become. Let's play with, your Georgia Southerns, your Georgia States, and your Troys, and all these other teams, and even to a certain extent, the lower level, your North Carolina States, your Dukes. But don't treat us and don't tease us into thinking, and that would put them at a crossroads. I want to say that they would because of they're in Atlanta. That's where the College Football Hall of Fame is. I mean, this is where a lot of people feel like it's a hot.
It's where SEC Media Days is this year.
It's where SEC Media Days is. I mean, you're smack dab in that market. But it would take a financial backing unlike anything that school has ever seen before in order to make it happen.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NBA Big Board podcast with Rafael Barlow, Richard Strayman, Sam Ferris, and Leif Thulin. Give fans an in-depth look at the biggest prospects, the latest player rankings, and, of course, big boards. Follow the Locked On NBA Big Board every day on the Audacity app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcast. Bryce, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This was a good conversation, and as this game gets closer, we need to do it again.
No, listen, I appreciate it. There's never a bad time to talk college football, and it's about to be June, so we're almost there. And I appreciate you. We'll have to do this again as we get closer to the game of the week.
Absolutely, bud. Thanks a bunch.